Hey guys, tonight we open the door to a story wrapped in cigarette smoke, whispered in dim hotel lobbies, and carried along the kind of corridors where the echo of your own footsteps makes you uneasy. We're going to follow a man whose life was a balancing act between shadow and substance. Reza Asgari, a figure who could walk past you in the street and leave no impression, yet shift the weight of nations behind the scenes. You probably won't survive this world for more than a day, not because of bullets, but because of the quiet weight of constant suspicion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you are right now and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tehran in the late 1970s is a city divided between the old monarchy's fading opulence and the hum of a revolution pressing in from the streets. Asgari, young but already disciplined, moves through this landscape with a sharp eye and quiet determination. He isn't yet the man foreign intelligence agencies will trade notes about, but the habits are forming. He watches, listens, and says less than necessary. When the Revolutionary Guard is formed after the upheaval of 1979, it offers him a path. Not the loud, flag-waving kind, but one that rewards discretion. His early years are marked by loyalty assignments, moving between units tasked with guarding officials, monitoring dissent, and keeping the new order's pulse steady. It's during these first postings that he learns the power of invisibility. He blends in not by accident, but by design. Historical fact: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, was born from the revolution itself, intended as both a military force and an ideological safeguard. In those days, recruitment favored men who could be trusted implicitly, not necessarily the most outspoken, but the most reliable in keeping state matters sealed away from public view. Asgari fits this mold perfectly. In barracks conversations, others might talk about ambition, climbing ranks, earning recognition. He talks about nothing at all. It's not that he has no dreams, it's that they're carefully folded away, stored for a time when revealing them could serve a purpose. He carries himself with the discipline of a soldier and the instincts of a spy. By the early 1980s, when Iran's war with Iraq erupts, Asgari is no longer a raw recruit. He's assigned to logistics and intelligence coordination, work that keeps him away from the trenches, but places him at the nexus of movement, weapons, information, and people. A single misplaced manifest, a delay in supply lines, could cost lives. He treats the paperwork as if it's a loaded rifle. At night, in the low hum of the operations room, he studies maps under dim light. Every arrow on the chart means a convoy, every dot a storage depot. He begins to see patterns others miss, routes that could serve not only the military, but something broader, more flexible, less tied to the rigid battlefield lines. It's not yet smuggling, not yet. But the skeleton of it is forming in his mind. One colleague, years later, would say that Asgari never wasted a handshake. Every introduction was noted, every name cataloged, every gesture remembered. It was a skill that, at the time, looked like simple politeness, but would later become the foundation of his network. Many people still think that these formative years were what made him untouchable later on, that the war gave him not only a soldier's resilience, but a broker's vision. So what do you think? Is a man shaped more by the battles he fights, or by the quiet days in between, where deals are made without firing a shot? For Asgari, the answer doesn't matter. What matters is that by the time the war winds down, he has built something far more valuable than medals: trust and a deep understanding of how power moves unseen. The war's end doesn't bring rest, it brings repositioning. For Ali Reza Asgari, the ceasefire is not a curtain call, but a scene change. Iran is shifting from survival to strategy, and the Revolutionary Guard is transforming from wartime defense to peacetime dominance. Men who understand logistics, like Asgari, suddenly become indispensable in a different way. In Tehran's ministries, the air smells of tea and dusted carpets, but the conversations are anything but ceremonial. The post-war years are fertile ground for covert projects, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, yes, but also expanding influence abroad. Asghari's skill with routes and contacts is quietly redirected from moving artillery shells to moving materials, whose official descriptions leave plenty of room for interpretation. The world outside Iran is equally restless. The 1990s bring a shifting Middle East, alliances bending, proxy wars simmering. For someone like Asghari, whose value lies in his ability to make connections without being seen, this is opportunity disguised as duty. He steps into a role where borders are less a barrier and more a set of doors to be unlocked with the right handshake. Inside the IRGC's elite Quds force, responsible for operations beyond Iran's borders, he becomes known for his ability to broker relationships in places where open diplomacy is impossible. This isn't the kind of work that gets your name on a press release. It's the kind where your name is never written down at all. One of his early quiet triumphs involved securing a corridor through a patchwork of territories in the Levant. Officially, it's to ensure humanitarian supplies reach affected communities. Unofficially, it's a lifeline for moving assets that will shift the balance in a regional conflict. No gunfire, no headlines, just a signature on a customs form and a convoy that no one stops. Historical fact: the Quds force, established in the late 1980s, specialized in unconventional warfare and intelligence operations. It was their job to cultivate networks, train allied militias, and secure influence through means that rarely involved official state channels. Men like Asgari thrived in this murky overlap between diplomacy, espionage, and commerce. In meetings, he listens more than he speaks. His sentences are clipped, his tone almost bored, but his eyes take in everything. The way someone's hand lingers over a briefcase, the glance between two men who aren't supposed to know each other. He files these details away for later, because later always comes. The nickname, the man behind the curtain, begins to surface among those who work near him. It's not a compliment exactly, but it's not an insult either. It's a recognition. Whatever deal is being discussed, Asghari probably had a hand in arranging the meeting, even if he never sits at the table. This kind of work demands an unusual discipline, not just in keeping secrets, but in knowing which ones to let slip at the right moment. Sometimes an enemy needs to think they've intercepted something valuable, so they stop digging for the truth. Sometimes an ally needs to believe they owe you a favor, even if you've already repaid it 3 times over. Asghari's genius lies in pulling these threads without the fabric ever seeming disturbed. Many people still think that his greatest weapon wasn't money, or weapons, or political leverage. It was patience. The kind of patience that can wait months for the right call to be returned, years for the right man to be in the right office. So what do you think? Does patience win the game, or is it the quick strike that changes history? By the mid-1990s, he is no longer just an officer in the Guard. He's a node in a sprawling web. A call to Asghari might mean an introduction in Beirut, a shipment in Damascus, or an account opened in a bank where no one asks too many questions. The lines between soldier, diplomat, and businessman blur until they're indistinguishable. The term broker sounds almost harmless, like someone haggling over carpets in a quiet bazaar. But in Ali Reza Asgari's world, being a broker means dealing in leverage, sometimes measured in cash, sometimes in weapons, sometimes in the kind of information that can topple governments if it falls into the wrong hands. By the late 1990s, his role inside the Quds force is defined less by formal titles and more by what people know he can make happen. Need a shipment to cross 3 borders without inspection. Asgari knows which customs chief's daughter is getting married this week, and how to send the right gift. Need 2 rival factions to meet without killing each other before dessert? He knows whose cousin can get them into the same room without either side losing face. Officially, he serves as a senior officer responsible for foreign liaisons. In practice, this means he's the man you call when official channels are too slow or too visible. The art of his work lies in making things appear organic, an agreement that seems to arise naturally from shared interest, a coincidence of timing that just happens to serve Tehran's needs. One of his most notable feats involves brokering a multi-party exchange between groups in the Persian Gulf and partners in Eastern Europe. The paperwork lists the cargo as industrial parts. The reality is far more complicated. Components that, once assembled, could significantly alter the capabilities of an allied force. Every transaction is wrapped in layers of deniability. Freight forwarders who don't know the true client, ports that don't ask questions if the fees are paid promptly. Historical fact. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, Iran was heavily involved in covert arms transfers to allied groups, often routed through third-party nations to mask origin. These operations required not just logistical skill, but deep networks of personal trust, because one leak could unravel years of careful planning. Asgari doesn't deal in bluster. While some operatives try to project intimidation, he projects competence. His meetings are efficient, his agreements rarely written down, his promises always delivered. Because in his world, a failed promise is remembered longer than a signed contract. Colleagues notice his tendency to pay attention to the smallest, seemingly irrelevant details. If a contact switches the brand of cigarettes they smoke, Asgari wonders why. If a usually punctual courier is 5 minutes late, he asks where the delay occurred. These aren't idle curiosities. They're breadcrumbs in a mental map of loyalties, pressures, and vulnerabilities. The risk of his position is that he's always walking a tightrope between factions with competing agendas. Iran's allies are not always each other's allies, and sometimes keeping them in the same orbit requires a delicate fiction. The illusion must hold long enough for each party to get what they want, or at least believe they will. Many people still think that it was during these years that Asgari began to realize the danger of his own value, that knowing too much and being able to act on it makes you both irreplaceable and expendable. So what do you think? Is the most powerful man in the room the one who talks the most, or the one whose silence holds the answers? By the early 2000s, Asgari's reputation has expanded beyond the Middle East. European intelligence agencies file reports noting a trusted intermediary in Iran's network whose movements are difficult to track. They give him different code names in different languages, but the pattern is always the same. Deals struck in backrooms, outcomes that align with Tehran's interests, and no fingerprints on the evidence. For Asgari, The work isn't just about ideology or duty anymore. It's a craft, one he's honed so precisely that even those closest to him can't tell where loyalty ends and personal strategy begins. If the Persian Gulf was Asgari's proving ground, Lebanon was his laboratory. It was here, in the narrow streets of Beirut and the rugged hills beyond, that he refined the art of influence into something almost surgical. The Lebanese conflict zones were a place where ideology, money, and survival were in constant negotiation, and Asgari knew how to speak all three languages without changing his tone. His connection to Hezbollah wasn't born from shared political manifestos. It grew out of practicality. They needed resources. Tehran needed reliable partners on the ground. In the middle stood men like Asgari, quiet facilitators who could turn political intent into material reality. He wasn't the man giving fiery speeches at rallies. He was the one ensuring that the crates stamped with agricultural equipment were delivered to exactly the right warehouse at exactly the right hour. Historical fact. Hezbollah, founded in the early 1980s with Iranian backing, relied heavily on logistical and financial support from Tehran to sustain its military capabilities. By the late 1990s, the Quds Force had perfected the channels for this support, often disguising weapons shipments as civilian cargo to slip past international monitoring. Beirut in those days was a city of divided realities. Cafes full of students debating politics under neon lights, and alleys where armed men vanished into the dark without a sound. Asgari moved between both worlds effortlessly. By day, he might sit with a Lebanese businessman over coffee, discussing imports and tariffs. By night, he might be in a basement, overseeing the unpacking of materials no customs official would ever see on a manifest. One of his signature methods was to make each transaction look like a local affair. Rather than Iranian operatives handling the full chain, he would fragment the process. Local drivers here, regional intermediaries there, so that no single link in the chain could betray the whole picture. He understood that trust in such environments was transactional. A payment delivered on time, a favor returned without delay. These were the currencies that mattered more than ideology. And while Hezbollah leaders might speak in the language of resistance, Asgari spoke in the language of logistics. Dates, quantities, and routes that could bend reality to fit Tehran's needs. In the shadows, he cultivated a reputation among his Lebanese contacts as someone who could solve problems others wouldn't touch. A convoy stalled at a checkpoint. He could get it moving before the coffee cooled in your cup. A shipment delayed at port? He'd know which inspector's brother needed a medical referral to speed things up. Many people still think that his time in Lebanon was the turning point, the moment when he shifted from being a regional facilitator to an international operator. So what do you think? Is influence measured by the number of people you can command, or by the number of people who will quietly bend the rules for you without being asked? By the time he left Lebanon for the next phase of his career, Asgari had built more than a supply chain. He had built a network of human obligations, favors owed, debts unspoken, secrets shared in quiet corners. It was a foundation that would follow him and protect him long after he stepped out of the Beirut night. The routes didn't just exist on maps. They lived in people's minds, passed along like folklore in the quiet exchanges between drivers, port officials, and traders who knew better than to put anything in writing. Asgari became their cartographer, but instead of ink, he drew with influence and favors. Smuggling is an ugly word in diplomatic circles, but in Asgari's hands, it was reframed as logistics under constraint. Every path was a living organism, changing with seasons, politics, and the shifting allegiances of those guarding the borders. A mountain pass that was safe in spring might be impossible by winter, but he had a plan for each turn in the weather. Historical fact: Iran's clandestine networks in the late 1990s and early 2000s depended on a patchwork of such routes, some by sea, others overland, linking the Persian Gulf, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. These lines carried more than weapons. They moved currency, electronics, and at times, individuals whose presence in a certain city could change the balance of a negotiation. Asgari approached the problem like an engineer. He'd separate each route into segments: a driver who only knew his starting point and destination, a warehouse worker who didn't know where the goods came from, a contact at a border crossing who recognized only a coded phrase. If one piece failed, the others could continue, and the bigger picture stayed invisible. This method also insulated him. If the wrong shipment was intercepted, he could plausibly claim ignorance, and those who worked the chain would have nothing concrete to connect him to the loss. It was a cold form of self-preservation, but in his world, survival depended on limiting the number of people who could truly know your role. On the ground, the safe houses were as important as the routes. They were rarely grand, often just rented apartments or back rooms in unremarkable neighborhoods, but each was chosen for a reason. Sometimes the reason was a sympathetic landlord. Other times it was proximity to an unmarked alley that allowed for discreet movement at night. He had an instinct for knowing when a location was burned, even before trouble arrived. A shopkeeper who used to chat freely now keeping his head down. A policeman taking too much interest in the comings and goings of delivery trucks. These were signals Asgari never ignored. When that happened, he'd close the house without explanation, move the operation overnight, and leave the locals wondering why the lights never came back on. The brilliance of his network wasn't that it was invisible, it was that it looked like everything else. His trucks weren't unmarked. They carried the logos of legitimate companies. His couriers weren't shadowy figures in alleyways. They were ordinary men hauling crates of produce or textiles. He knew that the best way to hide something was to make it blend so seamlessly into the scenery that no one thought to look twice. Many people still think that the strength of his smuggling infrastructure was what made him indispensable to Tehran, and perhaps also what made him dangerous to those who valued control over loyalty. So what do you think? Is a man more dangerous when he controls the weapons or when he controls the roads they travel on? By the early 2000s, these routes had become more than lines on a map for Asgari. They were arteries, and he was the one who kept the blood moving. To disrupt them would be to cripple not just one operation, but the entire body of Iran's regional influence. That kind of power doesn't go unnoticed, and in his world, attention is rarely a gift. By the time Asgari's network was humming like a well-oiled machine, so were the scanners and watch lists of the West. Intelligence agencies in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv had begun to notice patterns. Cargo that consistently avoided inspection, names that kept appearing in whispered conversations, destinations that didn't align with official manifests. And somewhere in those reports, his shadow began to take shape. Western operatives rarely had his name in the early days. Instead, they described him in fragments. A fixer in Tehran with reach into Lebanon. A Quds Force intermediary, fluent in more than one language of persuasion. The man who gets things done without leaving a paper trail. Those fragments began to align, and when they did, Asgari's movements started drawing red circles on maps pinned up in secure rooms. Historical fact: in the early 2000s, Western intelligence agencies significantly ramped up monitoring of Iranian overseas operations particularly after evidence of arms transfers to non-state actors surfaced. Sophisticated cargo scanning, port surveillance, and covert intercepts became a daily challenge for operators like Asgari. For him, awareness of the attention wasn't a surprise. It was a variable. He understood that surveillance could be as predictable as a train schedule if you knew how to read it. If a port suddenly increased inspections on certain days, that wasn't a reason to panic. It was an opportunity to redirect shipments through quieter channels. He even fed the watchers from time to time. Let them catch a shipment that was meant to be caught, one with goods so mundane, so obviously harmless, that their victory would taste hollow. The real prize would already be miles away, riding in the back of a truck carrying crates of dates to a marketplace no one thought to search. Western intelligence officers began noting this pattern, how near misses never quite connected, how even intercepted communications felt like listening to half a conversation. It was infuriating. Somewhere behind the curtains, someone was anticipating their moves, almost as if he was reading their playbook. Asgari's caution extended to his personal life. Meetings with known associates were rare, and always in locations where both parties could disappear into a crowd within seconds. Even his own security detail often didn't know the real purpose of a trip until it was over. If you asked him directly, he'd probably say something that sounded like a joke, something about keeping people guessing. But beneath the humor was a simple truth. The fewer people who knew, the safer the operation. This is where the tension began to build between him and certain factions within Iran's own system. Some saw his independence as a strength, others saw it as a liability. The West wasn't the only one watching him. There were eyes in Tehran as well, and not all of them were friendly. Many people still think that the real danger to Asgari came not from his foreign adversaries, but from those at home who feared he had become too powerful, too connected, and too hard to control. So what do you think? Is a man more at risk when hunted by enemies, or when mistrusted by his own side? By the mid-2000s, the tension was undeniable. Every move he made was a calculation not just against Western intelligence, but against currents inside Iran that were shifting in unpredictable ways. The routes were still open, the deals still flowing, but the walls, both visible and invisible, were closing in. In Tehran, loyalty is currency, and like any currency, its value fluctuates with the political weather. Ali Reza Asgari had always been careful to keep his accounts balanced, delivering results for the leadership, maintaining ties with trusted officers, and never appearing to belong entirely to any one faction. But the higher he climbed, the harder it became to stay neutral in a system that thrived on rivalries. His success abroad had made him a valuable asset, but it had also made him a point of contention. The question whispered in certain corridors was simple. Was he serving the state's interests or his own? For men in his position, the difference could be both negligible and fatal. Asghari's balancing act wasn't just political, it was personal. He knew that every alliance came with an expiration date, and that today's ally could be tomorrow's obstacle. Over dinners in shadowed corners of Tehran restaurants, he would listen to competing visions for Iran's future. Some spoke of expanding influence aggressively. Others urged a quieter, more cautious approach. He never took sides openly. Instead, he nodded, asked questions, and left each meeting with the other party convinced he agreed with them. Historical fact. Internal divisions within the Iranian leadership and the IRGC were well documented during the early 2000s, often revolving around strategy, resource allocation, and how overt or covert foreign operations should be. Officers who straddled multiple camps were both prized for their flexibility and distrusted for their lack of declared loyalty. This ambiguity gave Asgari room to maneuver, but it also meant he was under constant scrutiny. Files began to circulate, not public, not official, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Who exactly benefited from his deals? Were his networks loyal to Tehran, or to him personally? And if push came to shove, where would his loyalties lie? He understood the danger in being indispensable. The more irreplaceable you are, the more tempting it becomes for someone to test just how much the system depends on you. So he worked to make himself necessary in ways that weren't obvious. Small favors for the right people. Discreet problem solving that no one else could handle. Outcomes that made the leadership look stronger without revealing the strings he had pulled to get there. Many people still think that this period marked the beginning of his exit strategy, that he started preparing contingencies not because he wanted to leave, but because he knew he might one day have no choice. So what do you think? Does a man in his position survive by doubling down on loyalty, or by making sure he has somewhere else to land when the ground shifts? In private, Asgari never spoke openly of fear, but those who knew him best noticed subtle changes. He began keeping his travel plans even more closely guarded. His circle of trusted associates shrank. Meetings became shorter, more to the point. And in those rare moments when he let his guard slip, there was an edge in his voice, a quiet acknowledgement that the game he had been playing for decades was entering a more dangerous phase. By 2006, that phase was in full swing. The work was still there, the contacts still answering his calls, but the air around him had changed. It was heavier now, and it carried the unmistakable scent of something approaching, though from which direction, he could not yet tell. Diplomacy is often described as a formal dance, one of banquets, speeches, and handshakes in front of flags. For Ali Reza Asgari, it was something far more improvised. He used the cover of diplomacy not to charm journalists or give stirring addresses, but to slip in and out of countries without drawing suspicion. Officially, he held posts that justified his travel: liaison work, security consultations, attendance at regional conferences. These titles were perfect camouflage. They provided invitations, official vehicles, and most importantly, plausible reasons to be in places where his real business was never mentioned. An airport arrival in Ankara, a meeting in Damascus, a stopover in Beirut. Each trip was a blend of visible agenda and invisible purpose. Historical fact: it was common for senior IRGC and Quds Force officials to operate under diplomatic cover, particularly in embassies or as military attachés, which granted them a degree of immunity and freedom of movement that ordinary operatives could never enjoy. Asgari's use of diplomatic missions was almost artistic. An official meeting with a foreign defense representative might be followed, hours later, by a quiet drive to an unmarked building, where discussions had nothing to do with the public agenda. Sometimes, the two meetings even overlapped. He would bring along a translator, who was, in reality, there to pass messages to someone waiting outside. He favored environments where his movements would blend into a crowd of other high-level visitors. International summits, cultural delegations, religious conferences, any gathering where security was tight, but the list of attendees was long enough to hide him in plain sight. In such places, everyone was important, which meant no one could watch everyone at once. In the diplomatic lounges of airports, he was polite, restrained, never ostentatious. He'd share tea with visiting officials, trade pleasantries about the weather, and all the while his real attention was on the comings and goings at the gates, on which foreign attachés had just arrived. and which ones were traveling with assistants who didn't quite fit the role. When the West began tightening restrictions and screening even high-level travelers more thoroughly, Asgari adapted. He cut down on the number of trips with obvious political weight and increased visits that looked routine, even mundane. A trade delegation on agriculture, for example, could hide a separate meeting about securing supply channels for something entirely unrelated to farming. Many people still think that his mastery of diplomatic cover was his most underappreciated skill. That it wasn't just about getting into places, but about getting out unnoticed. So what do you think? Is the true art of diplomacy in the deal that gets signed, or in the deal that leaves no signature at all? By 2006, his passport had more stamps than most airline pilots. Each trip was a calculated risk, but one he was willing to take because every journey expanded his reach. The borders on the map weren't barriers to him, they were doors, and he knew exactly which ones would open with the right knock. Syria was more than a waypoint for Ali Reza Asgari. It was a bridge between Iran's ambitions and the volatile landscape of the Levant. Damascus, with its layered history and web of allegiances, offered him a stage where every meeting could shift a regional balance. Officially, he visited as part of defense and security coordination between two allied governments. Unofficially, his work there was a mix of brokering, troubleshooting, and sealing deals that could never appear on any ledger. The Syrian capital was perfect for this kind of work. Foreign delegations passed through constantly, and the presence of military advisors, trade envoys, and political liaisons was so common that another Iranian visitor drew little attention. Within this backdrop, Asgari could arrange discreet meetings under the guise of routine bilateral discussions. Historical fact: throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Syria served as a critical hub for Iranian regional operations, providing both a logistical route to Lebanon and a diplomatic ally in deflecting Western pressure. Military and intelligence exchanges between the two countries were frequent and often conducted behind closed doors. In Damascus, Asgari had a pattern. He would start with formal talks in government buildings, rooms heavy with dark wood furniture and the faint smell of strong coffee, then gradually peel away from the official itinerary. A scheduled rest day might turn into an evening drive into the suburbs, where he'd meet intermediaries connected to Hezbollah, Palestinian groups, or other regional actors whose interests aligned with Tehran's, at least for the moment. These meetings often felt like playing chess on three boards at once. A concession to one group might open a door with another, but it could also risk alienating a third. Asgari was careful to never let anyone see all the pieces in play. To each, he gave only what they needed to stay committed, while holding back enough to keep them coming back. Sometimes, the talks were about tangible things: routes, funding, supplies. Other times they were about perception. In a region where rumors could move faster than convoys, shaping a narrative was as valuable as delivering a shipment. Asgari would drop certain bits of information, knowing they'd be repeated, reshaped, and eventually serve the story Tehran wanted told. He knew the risks of working in Syria. The intelligence presence there was thick: Syrian, Iranian, Western, even Israeli. Every hotel lobby could be a listening post. Every driver could have another employer. But the overlapping interests in Damascus created a kind of cover all their own. Everyone was talking to someone they shouldn't be, which made it easier for him to blend in with the noise. Many people still think that his time in Syria cemented his reputation as a ghost negotiator, someone who could move between factions without becoming beholden to any of them. So what do you think? Is real influence about controlling the outcome, or about ensuring you can still walk away no matter how the deal ends. By the time he returned to Tehran from each Syrian visit, his briefcases carried nothing incriminating, just papers, maybe a few gifts from hosts, and a well-rehearsed account of meetings attended. But the real cargo was in his head: new understandings, updated loyalties, and a fresh layer of threads to weave into the wider network he was quietly tightening around the region. Success in the shadows has a price, and for Ali Reza Asgari, that price began to take the shape of enemies within his own walls. By the mid-2000s, whispers in Tehran's security corridors carried his name in a tone that mixed respect with unease. The very network that had made him invaluable also made him suspect. Inside the Revolutionary Guard, factions were shifting. Some officers pushed for a harder, more confrontational stance toward the West, while others favored a quieter, more calculated approach. Asgari, ever the pragmatist, didn't plant his flag in either camp. He was too careful for that. But his refusal to declare allegiance meant both sides saw him as a potential liability. Historical fact: the IRGC's upper ranks have long been shaped by internal rivalries, where power struggles are often as intense as the organization's conflicts with external adversaries. Those who stayed neutral risked being accused of disloyalty by everyone. In closed-door briefings, his name started surfacing alongside phrases like operating independently and excessive autonomy. That autonomy had been an asset when results mattered more than process. But in times of internal uncertainty, it became a red flag. People began asking questions. Who exactly benefited from his deals? Could his loyalty be guaranteed if political tides turned? For Asgari, the change was subtle but clear. Invitations to certain strategy meetings stopped arriving. Routine updates that used to flow freely now arrived filtered, delayed, or not at all. The kind of invisible frost that spreads before anyone openly calls you an outsider had begun to settle over his position. Still, he played the game. At receptions, he smiled and shook hands. At briefings, he spoke when spoken to, offered concise updates, and revealed nothing more than necessary. But he also began spending more time outside the direct line of command, focusing on his contacts abroad, cultivating relationships that didn't depend on his standing in Tehran. The tension wasn't just professional. Some of the men now circling against him were former allies, people he had once protected or promoted. In the shifting sands of Iranian politics, debts can be forgotten faster than favors can be repaid. Many people still think that by this point, Asgari was already laying the groundwork for a possible exit, whether voluntary or forced. So what do you think? Is the smartest move in politics to stand your ground, or to prepare the door before someone else decides you need to walk through it? By late 2006, the lines between friend and rival were blurring. The work still came, but so did the silences, the missing pieces, the sudden sense that the walls had begun leaning inward. And somewhere in that narrowing space, the seeds of his disappearance were being sown. Power in Tehran was never just about politics. It was also about resources. And while Ali Reza Asgari's public profile was modest, his private financial footing was anything but. Over the years, he had cultivated quiet streams of income, each as discreetly managed as his smuggling routes. The money didn't come in bundles of cash under tables. It came through companies with legitimate fronts, contracts signed under aliases, and investments tucked away in jurisdictions far from prying eyes. Historical fact: many senior figures in the IRGC and Quds Force have been linked to legitimate business holdings that operate in construction, shipping, telecommunications, and import-export sectors, some serving as cover for intelligence operations, others as personal revenue streams. Asgari's ventures were spread wide enough to make them hard to trace. A shipping company that moved goods across the Mediterranean also moved dividends into an account in the Gulf. A construction firm in a small Middle Eastern capital won government contracts with suspicious regularity. Even an agricultural supplier in Central Asia carried his fingerprints, supplying more than just seeds and tools to those who needed discreet logistical support. These businesses served a dual purpose. They provided Tehran with deniable supply lines, and they gave Asgari personal leverage. In his world, wealth wasn't about luxury, it was about options. A man with no resources is a man who has to accept whatever terms are offered. A man with quiet wealth can negotiate his own escape route, but building personal resources in a state system built on loyalty was a delicate game. Too much visible prosperity invited questions. Too little, and you risked losing influence. Asgari walked the line by keeping his lifestyle modest. His home in Tehran was respectable, but not ostentatious. His wardrobe conservative, his vehicles practical. The luxury was in his freedom to travel, to host discreet dinners in safe houses abroad, to fund projects without asking for permission. Those close to him began noticing he traveled with fewer aides and more assistants, who weren't on official payrolls. Some were business partners. Others were trusted intermediaries who could move assets or arrange transfers without attracting state attention. To the untrained eye, they were just part of his entourage. To anyone paying closer attention, they were his safety net. Many people still think that these parallel financial channels were the real key to his independence, and possibly the real reason some in Tehran began to see him as a threat. So what do you think? Is it wealth or loyalty that truly determines a man's survival in the world of power? By the end of 2006, Asgari had accumulated not just money, but mobility. He could finance a move, establish himself abroad, and maintain his network without relying on official support. It was a quiet kind of power, but in a system built on control, even quiet power can be dangerous. If money was Asgari's safety net, information was his weapon of choice. His world ran on whispers, some accurate, some deliberately distorted, all valuable in the right hands. Over decades, he had perfected the art of trading knowledge without ever seeming like he was doing it. The whisper network he cultivated wasn't limited to fellow Iranians or regional allies. It reached into European capitals, Gulf boardrooms, and even the quieter corners of diplomatic missions where board attachés exchanged gossip over late-night coffee. Sometimes the information he gathered was tactical, shipping schedules, border security rotations. Other times, it was about personalities. Which minister's son was in debt, which general was feuding with which cousin, which official had a habit of meeting strangers in hotel lobbies. Historical fact. Intelligence work is often as much about human vulnerabilities as it is about military capabilities. The IRGC and Quds Force historically relied heavily on personal relationships to gather, trade, and exploit such knowledge. Asgari didn't hoard these secrets, at least not all of them. He used them like currency, paying with words instead of bills. A small piece of accurate intelligence given to the right person could buy him weeks of goodwill. A well-placed rumor could distract an adversary long enough for a shipment to pass unnoticed. The brilliance of his method lay in the balance. He never gave away too much at once, and he never let anyone believe they were his only source. This kept people leaning in, eager for the next scrap, and ensured that his network never collapsed if one node went dark. In some cases, he would deliberately mix truth with plausible fabrication. The goal wasn't always to inform, it was to shape perception. If a rival thought they were intercepting privileged information, they were less likely to look for the real channels of communication. He was also skilled at listening without commitment. In meetings, he'd tilt his head slightly, as though weighing every word, but offer little in return. The silence made others talk more, filling the void with details they might not have planned to share. By the end, they'd leave thinking they'd outmaneuvered him, unaware that they had just become part of his intelligence ledger. Many people still think that his mastery of human intel made him more dangerous than any cache of weapons or vault of gold. That in the right hands, one secret could be worth more than 1,000 rifles. So, what do you think? Is the sharper blade in power politics made of steel or of silence? By early 2007, Asgari's whisper network had grown so intricate that pulling on one thread could rattle people in 6 countries. It was a delicate web, but one he could navigate blindfolded, a skill that would prove both his greatest advantage and perhaps his greatest vulnerability. There was always a duality to Ali Reza Asgari's life. 2 faces he wore depending on the room, the audience, and the purpose. To the state and the loyalist press, he was the decorated Revolutionary Guard commander, a patriot whose career had been spent safeguarding Iran's interests abroad. To those in the shadows, he was the man who could move money, arms, or people with equal efficiency, often without anyone knowing who had made it happen. This man of 2 worlds persona didn't happen by accident. He crafted it over decades, making sure each side of his identity reinforced the other. His official role gave him the authority to move freely, to justify his presence in volatile places, and to shield himself under the banner of national service. His unofficial role gave him influence in circles the state couldn't always touch. Smugglers, brokers, militia leaders, financiers who had no flag but plenty of ambition. Historical fact. Throughout modern history, intelligence operatives have often occupied such dual spaces: legitimate military or diplomatic roles on one side, clandestine dealings on the other. This dual identity allows them to operate openly while conducting missions their titles never officially acknowledge. Asgari knew the value of maintaining both images. Too much time in the shadows, and you became a liability to the official system. Too much time in the open, and you risked losing the flexibility and deniability that covert work required. He balanced the two with an almost theatrical sense of timing, stepping into the light when it served him, retreating into the dark when it didn't. His family lived comfortably but without ostentation, allowing him to present the picture of a disciplined, patriotic servant of the state. Yet those who interacted with him outside Iran noticed a different man, one who could navigate a European capital's political salons just as easily as a borderland smuggler den. What struck people most was his ability to adapt his language and demeanor to the person in front of him. With an officer from the IRGC, he was precise and formal. With a Lebanese field commander, he could be earthy and direct. With a businessman in the Gulf, he spoke in the measured terms of trade and investment. It wasn't about deception, it was about resonance. Many people still think that this duality was what kept him untouchable for so long, and also what made him impossible to fully trust. So what do you think? Is a man more dangerous when you can never see all his sides, or when you think you can? By early 2007, Asgari's 2 worlds were still in balance, but there were signs of strain. In the official one, certain doors were beginning to close. In the unofficial one, the stakes were rising, and so was the scrutiny. Holding them both together was becoming a harder act than it had ever been. The trip to Turkey in early 2007 was framed as nothing unusual, at least on paper. Ankara was a city Asgari knew well, a place where Iran's official interests and unofficial channels often intersected. Business, diplomacy, and quiet deals had long flowed through its hotels, conference rooms, and discreet cafes. The stated purpose of his visit was unremarkable. A private trip, part business, part personal. For a man of his position, crossing into Turkey without ceremony wasn't unusual. The country had long served as a neutral ground where Iranians could meet foreign contacts without the suffocating scrutiny of Tehran or the heightened dangers of certain Arab capitals. Historical fact: Turkey's unique position, bridging Europe and the Middle East, with relatively open travel arrangements for Iranians, made it a favored meeting point for diplomats, businessmen, and intelligence operatives from across the region. But this trip was different in small, almost imperceptible ways. Asgari traveled without the larger entourage he sometimes used. He carried less luggage. His movements weren't logged with the same thoroughness as before, leaving gaps in the itinerary that, in hindsight, would become glaring. Friends and associates in Tehran later recalled that he'd been quieter than usual in the weeks before leaving. Not withdrawn exactly, but measured, choosing his words more carefully, avoiding long conversations about the future. One colleague remembered him refusing a proposal for a deal abroad, saying only, "Not now. Timing matters." Upon arriving in Turkey, he checked into a well-known hotel in Ankara, a place often frequented by visiting officials. The lobby was a blend of businessmen with briefcases, tourists with guidebooks, and the occasional figure who seemed to be watching the room more than the decor. In that setting, Asgari could easily blend in, as he always had. In the days that followed, he was seen in the company of a few familiar faces: contacts from the Gulf, a European with known intelligence ties, and curiously, a man some witnesses described as Israeli-looking, though that detail remains disputed. Meetings were brief, rarely in the same place twice, and often scheduled on short notice. Many people still think that this trip was either the execution of a long-laid plan or the setting of a trap. So, what do you think? When a man like Asgari steps into neutral territory, is he there to negotiate or to disappear? Whatever the truth, by the time the sun set on his final day in Ankara, the stage was set for the event that would turn him from a player in the shadows into one of the most intriguing missing persons cases of the 21st century. The last confirmed sighting of Ali Reza Asgari came in the form of fragments, eyewitness accounts, security camera footage, and scattered recollections from people who had no idea they were part of a much larger story. It was early evening in Ankara, the winter air sharp enough to make breath visible. He was seen leaving his hotel, dressed in a dark coat, moving with his usual unhurried pace. A bellhop later said he seemed calm but focused, as if running through a mental checklist. From there, he walked toward a car waiting near the side entrance, an unremarkable sedan, silver or light gray, depending on which witness you ask. Historical fact: reports from Turkish sources suggest that Asgari was last seen in public on or around February 7, 2007. After that point, no verifiable public appearances were documented, and his name began to surface in intelligence circles as unaccounted for. The hotel's security cameras caught him stepping into the vehicle. The footage ends there. No follow-up shot of the car leaving, no license plate clearly visible. Whether that gap in the recording was coincidence, malfunction, or design has been debated ever since. Some witnesses claim he stopped briefly at a small cafe later that night. The owner remembered him sipping tea alone, glancing occasionally toward the door. Others recall a man matching his description walking along a quieter street near the diplomatic quarter. But none of these accounts have been confirmed, and each could be a case of memory playing tricks in the retelling. What is certain is that by the next morning, he had vanished from all the places he was expected to be. He missed a scheduled breakfast meeting with a business associate. Calls to his Turkish mobile went unanswered. The hotel room he'd been using was found empty, with his personal effects neatly arranged, passport missing, but a few changes of clothes left behind. Many people still think that the last confirmed sighting was staged, that Asgari wanted certain people to see him one final time before he stepped off the visible map. So, what do you think? Does a man vanish more cleanly by slipping away unseen, or by leaving behind an image others will spend years trying to interpret? In Ankara, the cold February streets soon returned to their normal rhythm. But for the people who had crossed paths with him in those last hours, the memory lingered. A quiet man in a dark coat, walking into a car and into history. Disappearances are rarely clean, but in Asghari's case, it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. One moment, he was a man with decades of connections, roots, and leverage. The next, there was nothing. No traceable departure from Turkey, no customs record, no flight manifest, no credit card transaction. Turkish authorities opened an investigation almost immediately, though its depth and sincerity remain a matter of debate. Publicly, they made few statements. Privately, some officials hinted to journalists that the situation was complicated. Ankara was used to delicate diplomatic balances, but this case involved multiple intelligence services, each with its own narrative, historical fact. When intelligence operatives disappear abroad, host nations often face enormous pressure from competing powers, pressure to cooperate, to conceal, or to misdirect. Turkey's strategic position between East and West made it a frequent crossroads for such tensions. Speculation erupted in the press within days. Some claimed he had been abducted by Western intelligence, spirited away for debriefing about Iran's military programs. Others suggested he had defected voluntarily, trading his knowledge for safety and a new life under a different name. A smaller, more conspiratorial camp argued that Tehran itself had arranged his disappearance to keep certain secrets from ever leaking, by silencing him permanently. What stood out to those who had known him was how little physical disruption his vanishing seemed to cause. There was no sign of struggle at the hotel, no abrupt withdrawals from his accounts, no hurried calls in the hours before he went missing. If there was fear, it had been managed. If there was force, it had been invisible. For Asgari, invisibility had always been a skill, but now it was absolute. His safe houses, his shipping routes, his whisper network, all were left intact but leaderless. And yet, in those first weeks, there were small ripples. A shipment diverted, a meeting canceled without explanation, a contact in Beirut suddenly unreachable. It was as if the network itself was absorbing the shock, adjusting to life without its central figure. Many people still think that his disappearance had been prepared for months in advance, whether by him or by others, that the trip to Turkey was never about business, but about crossing an invisible border from one life into another. So what do you think? Does a man vanish best when others believe it happened suddenly, or when the plan has been hiding in plain sight all along? By March 2007, the whispers had grown louder, and the hunt for answers had spread beyond Ankara. But for those who had known him, the truth was already clear. Whatever happened in those hours after his last sighting, it wasn't chance. It was choreography. Theories came fast, multiplying like vines in the absence of sunlight. Each one clung to a fragment of truth, wrapped in layers of speculation. To outsiders, Ali Reza Asgari had simply vanished in Ankara. To those who understood the world he moved in, the possibilities were more precise and far more dangerous. The first theory was defection. Western intelligence agencies had long considered him a prime target, a man with decades of insider knowledge about Iran's military operations, foreign networks, and procurement programs. If they had orchestrated his departure, it would have been a high-value prize, quietly celebrated in rooms where the curtains never opened. Historical fact. In the years following Asghari's disappearance, multiple Western media outlets, citing unnamed intelligence sources, claimed that he had defected, providing information on Iran's nuclear program and regional strategies. Tehran dismissed these claims as propaganda. The second theory was abduction. This version painted a picture of a carefully planned operation, perhaps involving Mossad, CIA, or a joint task force. In this scenario, Asghari didn't choose to leave. He was taken. The precision would have been clinical. Surveillance of his movements in Ankara, identification of vulnerabilities in his security, and an extraction so swift that it left no public trace. Then there was the third theory, the one whispered most cautiously in Tehran, that his own government had engineered the vanishing, not as punishment, but as containment. If certain factions feared he might break ranks or reveal sensitive dealings, removing him from the board entirely, whether through isolation or worse, would be the surest way to silence him. Each theory had its champions. Each had holes. The defection story strained belief for those who knew his guarded nature. The abduction theory raised questions about how such an operation could succeed in Ankara without Turkish complicity. And the internal silencing theory required imagining a level of cold precision from Tehran that even some insiders found chilling. Many people still think that the truth lies in a hybrid of these stories, that Asgari may have signaled willingness to leave, and that one or more foreign agencies moved to make it happen before his own state could stop him. So, what do you think? Is the most convincing story the one that is simplest, or the one that explains why so many details refuse to fit neatly together? What was certain, even in those early months, was that no single narrative could settle the matter. The absence of evidence had become its own form of power. And in the world of espionage, unanswered questions often serve someone's interests far more than tidy conclusions. In the months after his disappearance, the game shifted from speculation to strategy. Intelligence agencies across the globe began moving like chess players who had just realized a key piece was missing from the board. For some, the goal was to find him. For others, it was to make sure no one else did. If Asgari had indeed been taken into the custody of a foreign service, the value of what he knew would have dictated the pace of events. Decades of operational knowledge meant he could map the Quds Force's overseas networks from memory, identify shell companies and safe houses, and point to vulnerabilities that might take years to exploit. Debriefing a man like that would not be a quick process. It would be a slow unwinding, pulling on threads until the whole tapestry lay bare. Historical fact: in cases where high-ranking defectors or captures occur, intelligence services often isolate the individual for extended periods, both to protect them and to ensure information is extracted methodically. Such cases rarely reach public confirmation until years later, if ever. Meanwhile, Tehran moved its own pieces. known operatives were shuffled to different postings. Routes Asgari had overseen were rerouted or shut down entirely. Certain projects went dormant, as if someone feared they had been compromised. Officially, Iranian authorities denied any concern, portraying the disappearance as the invention of hostile propaganda. Unofficially, their movements told another story, one of containment, damage control, and quiet paranoia. In Ankara, the Turkish role remained a question mark. If their intelligence services had cooperated with a foreign operation, they weren't saying. If they had been blindsided, admitting it would have been politically costly. So they said little at all, leaving journalists and analysts to stitch together timelines from scraps. The possibility of multiple agencies working against each other added another layer of complexity. If Mossad had been involved, they would have sought to monopolize the information. If the CIA had played a role, their priority would have been controlling the narrative. If both had touched the operation, directly or indirectly, then secrecy would have been even more fiercely guarded. For fear of revealing methods to each other as much as to Tehran, many people still think that what happened in those first weeks after Asgari vanished was less about where he was and more about who got to control the information he carried. So, what do you think? Is the real contest in espionage about capturing the man or about capturing the story of the man? By mid-2007, the ripples from his disappearance had traveled far beyond Iran and Turkey. Files were marked for restricted circulation. New security protocols were quietly introduced. And somewhere, behind locked doors, the slow, deliberate chess match over Ali Reza Asgari's future and the fate of the knowledge in his head was already well underway. Tehran's official reaction to Asgari's disappearance was a performance in controlled denial. Within days of his vanishing, state-aligned media insisted he had never been involved in sensitive operations, portraying him instead as a retired officer with no active ties to the government. The implication was clear. There was nothing to gain from his capture because he had nothing worth taking. But behind the scenes, the mood was far from dismissive. In certain ministries, late-night meetings stretched into dawn. Officers from the IRGC were quietly reassigned, travel clearances tightened, and long-standing contacts abroad were told to go dark until further notice. To those within the system, these moves said more than any press statement ever could. Historical fact: Iran has a long history of downplaying the significance of high-profile defections or captures, both to preserve internal morale and to deny adversaries the satisfaction of public acknowledgement. However, the simultaneous implementation of operational changes often reveals the true level of concern. The leadership's greatest fear was that Asgari had defected willingly. An abduction could be framed as an act of aggression. A voluntary crossing of lines was harder to spin. It would suggest that someone trusted at the highest levels had chosen to abandon the cause, a blow not just to security, but to the narrative of unshakable loyalty that underpinned the regime's self-image. For those who had worked alongside him, the official story was unconvincing. They knew his access, his responsibilities, and the depth of his network. They also knew that in Iran's internal hierarchy, such a man's movements were rarely unmonitored. For him to slip away without at least tacit approval from someone high up suggested either a catastrophic lapse or a carefully staged exit. In the weeks following, Tehran launched its own internal probe, not an open investigation, but a quiet combing of connections. Old associates were questioned, travel histories scrutinized, communications reviewed. No public arrests were made, but careers began to stall. Some suspected of being too close to Asgari found themselves sidelined, reassigned to posts far from the capital, or quietly retired. Many people still think that the sharpest reaction in Tehran wasn't panic over what Asgari might reveal, but over what his disappearance revealed about the fragility of their own control. So, what do you think? Is the greater danger in espionage the secrets that are stolen, or the realization of how easily they could be? By spring 2007, the public face of the Iranian government was calm, almost indifferent. But in the quiet rooms where strategy was decided, the disappearance was treated as a fault line, one that had already begun to shift the ground beneath them. For all the political and strategic tremors his disappearance caused, the human cost fell hardest on those closest to him. Asghari's family, his wife, children, and extended relatives, were left suspended between fear and uncertainty. In Tehran, their daily lives became a strange blend of routine and quiet interrogation. The calls began almost immediately. Some were official, requests to meet with concerned authorities who wanted to know when they'd last spoken to him, what he'd said, whether he'd seemed agitated. Others were less formal, friends or distant acquaintances asking questions under the guise of concern, probing for details that might confirm or contradict the rumors spreading through the city. Historical fact: families of high-ranking military or intelligence figures in Iran have often found themselves under informal house arrest or surveillance when those figures fall under suspicion. The scrutiny can last weeks, months, or even years, depending on the perceived threat. For the Asgari family, this meant a subtle but suffocating loss of freedom. Relatives noticed strangers parked near the house for hours. Conversations at the market were suddenly shorter, neighbors more cautious in their greetings. A cousin who had once visited weekly stopped coming altogether. Inside the home, there were no clear answers to give the children. Was their father safe? Would he be back? Could they tell their friends what had happened? The safest answer was silence, though it left them carrying a weight they couldn't name. Some relatives, quietly loyal to him, began taking precautions of their own, avoiding unnecessary travel, keeping personal records hidden, and limiting phone conversations. They knew that in cases like this, proximity could be dangerous. The family received no official confirmation of his status, no admission he was missing, no statement that he was wanted, no assurance that the state was working for his return. It was a limbo that left them exposed to whispers, but with no grounds to demand answers. Many people still think that this isolation was deliberate, a way to test whether the family would reach out to foreign contacts, which could be used as evidence of complicity. So, what do you think? Is it more effective to control a story by silencing the main player, or by surrounding his loved ones with enough fear to keep them from speaking? By summer 2007, the family had learned to live with the uncertainty. But in private moments, they still scanned the news for a name that rarely appeared anymore, wondering whether it was safer that way, or far worse. In the months that followed, investigators, both official and unofficial, chased leads that seemed promising at first, only to dissolve into nothing. False trails became the defining pattern of the search for Ali Reza Asgari. Some were deliberate misdirections, planted by those who wanted him found in the wrong place. Others were the inevitable byproduct of rumor filling the space where facts should have been. One early lead claimed he had been spotted boarding a ferry from Turkey to Cyprus. Witnesses described a man of similar build, wearing sunglasses and a cap, accompanied by two younger men. The tip generated a flurry of quiet inquiries, but port records revealed nothing. No matching name, no travel document, and no surveillance footage clear enough to confirm the sighting. Historical fact. In high-profile disappearances involving intelligence figures, false sightings are common, sometimes seeded by rival services to waste time and resources, other times the result of civilians mistaking someone for the missing figure. Another report placed him in a luxury hotel in Dubai, meeting with Western businessmen. The description was oddly specific. The color of the tie he wore, the brand of the pen he used to sign a paper. Investigators later determined the witness had been recalling a meeting from years earlier, long before his disappearance. These dead ends created frustration, but they also served a purpose for those managing the situation. Every false lead that went public diluted the credibility of the next report, making it easier to dismiss even accurate sightings as fantasy. Some leads were so precise they raised suspicion. A claim emerged from a source in Europe that Asgari had been moved to a safe house in the Balkans. The source offered exact coordinates and a list of vehicles spotted nearby. By the time anyone reached the location, it was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign anyone had been there in months. Many people still think that some of these false leads were part of an intentional noise field, created either by those protecting him or by those who wanted him permanently out of reach. So what do you think? Is the better shield for a missing man a hidden location or 100 false maps leading away from it? By the end of 2007, the number of viable leads had dwindled. The official files, what few existed, were cluttered with contradictory reports, and the trail had grown colder than the February night he was last seen. Among the many mysteries surrounding Asghari's disappearance, one of the most intriguing was the question of what he might have taken with him. Early on, whispers began circulating about missing files, documents, digital records, even physical notebooks that had been in his possession before he left Tehran. Historical fact. In intelligence operations, the loss of sensitive documents is often as damaging as the loss of personnel. Files can contain operational plans, asset identities, financial ledgers, and code systems that, if compromised, can unravel years of work. The rumors varied. Some claimed he carried a small encrypted hard drive containing details of Iran's overseas networks. Others insisted he had memorized the most critical data, leaving nothing physical to be intercepted. A few believed he had access to a set of paper files kept off the official books, records so sensitive they were never digitized. Inside Tehran, the possibility that such material had left the country sparked quiet alarm. Certain ongoing operations were abruptly paused. Communications protocols were changed, passwords rotated, and some assets abroad were extracted or relocated under urgent circumstances. The speed of these changes suggested that, at the very least, there was concern that operational security had been breached. In Ankara, Turkish intelligence refused to confirm whether any documents had been found in his hotel room. The absence of disclosure only fueled speculation. If something had been recovered, its contents and its current custodian remained a closely guarded secret. For those in the intelligence world, the idea that Asgari had walked away empty-handed seemed unlikely. A man of his experience would have known the value of carrying leverage into a new life, whether that leverage was meant for bargaining, protection, or both. Many people still think that the missing files were the real objective of whoever orchestrated his disappearance, more valuable than the man himself. So what do you think? In the world of espionage, is the greatest prize the operative or the archive he carries? By the time 2008 began, the question of the missing files had become just another shadow in a case already thick with them. No proof, no denial, just a widening gap where answers should have been. As the years passed, it became clear that Asghari's disappearance had altered more than just the rhythm of Tehran's internal security. It had sent ripples through international relations, subtly shifting the balance between states already locked in a quiet struggle for influence. For Israel, if the rumors of their involvement were even partially true, the event was a victory of rare magnitude. A man with deep insight into Iran's alliances, procurement methods, and covert routes was a treasure few intelligence agencies could dream of acquiring. Whether or not Mossad had played a role, the very suspicion strengthened Israel's image as a player capable of pulling off complex, high-stakes operations. Historical fact: Israel's Mossad has a long record of high-profile extractions and targeted operations beyond its borders, often aimed at neutralizing threats or acquiring critical intelligence on adversaries. For the United States, the story, if accurate, offered both an intelligence windfall and a diplomatic challenge. Washington had to weigh the benefits of whatever information Asgari might have provided against the risk of damaging relations with Turkey, a NATO ally, and further antagonizing Tehran. If the CIA was involved, the silence was calculated. If they weren't, the suspicion still served as a form of strategic ambiguity. Turkey, caught in the middle, faced perhaps the most delicate position. As a bridge between East and West, Ankara could ill afford to alienate either side. Publicly, they downplayed the matter, careful not to confirm any details that might suggest complicity or negligence. Privately, it's likely their intelligence service had already determined much more than they were willing to share. For Iran, the loss was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because Asghari's knowledge, if disclosed, could have forced costly overhauls of networks and operations. Symbolic, because it challenged the narrative of absolute loyalty expected from high-ranking members of the IRGC. Many people still think that the greatest impact of his disappearance wasn't in the data he might have given away, but in the shift it caused in how nations measured each other's reach. So what do you think? Is the real power in espionage about the secrets you hold, or the perception of what you might know? By the late 2000s, Asgari had become less a man and more a symbol, a cipher used in diplomatic arguments, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power, and a reminder that in the world of intelligence, the absence of a figure can be as influential as his presence. With the years stretching on and no confirmed trace of him, the idea that Ali Reza Asgari might still be alive became less a question of fact and more a matter of belief. The life in the shadows theory gained quiet traction among both intelligence circles and curious observers, built on occasional, tantalizing sightings in far-flung corners of the world. A man matching his description was reportedly seen in a small European city, living under a different name, frequenting the same cafe every morning. Another story placed him in South America, running a modest import business with no visible ties to his former life. None of these accounts were verifiable, but their persistence spoke to something deeper. People wanted to imagine he had found a way to keep moving, unseen but unbroken. Historical fact: former operatives who are relocated, whether through defection programs or covert extractions, often live under constructed identities, with strict rules about contact, movement, and even language use in public. The goal is to erase patterns that could lead an old adversary to their door. If Asgari had made such a transition, he would have had to give up more than just his name. The roots he built, the contacts he trusted, the language of his work, these would all have to be left behind. In their place, he would live a life defined by caution, every choice weighed against the possibility of recognition. Some doubted he could ever truly adapt. A man who had lived decades in a world of calculated risks might find the quiet suffocating. The discipline required to remain invisible would be familiar, but the lack of influence, the absence of his network, could be its own kind of exile. Many people still think that if he is alive, the conditions of that survival are as much a prison as any cell. So what do you think? Is it better for a man like Asgari to keep breathing in obscurity, or to burn brightly in the dangerous world he once ruled? By the 2010s, the rumors of his survival had become part of the mythology surrounding him, a reminder that in espionage, disappearing is never the same as being gone. Time has a way of turning hard facts into soft edges, and by the late 2010s, the story of Ali Reza Asgari had drifted into the realm of legend. His name surfaced in conversations like a code, spoken quietly in embassies, intelligence briefings, and the kind of discreet dinners where the guests all knew more than they admitted. In Tehran, his absence was both a wound and a warning. Younger officers in the IRGC were told his story in tones that mixed caution with admiration. The lesson was never stated outright, but it was clear. Power in the shadows comes with no guarantee of safety. Whether he had been taken, defected, or erased, the truth mattered less than the message. No one is beyond reach, historical fact. Even decades after unresolved disappearances, intelligence services often keep case files active, updating them with new sightings, intercepted chatter, or shifts in related networks. Official closure is rare because absence itself can be an ongoing security concern. Outside Iran, his name became shorthand for the perfect vanishing act. Journalists would revisit the story every few years, piecing together the same fragments, finding no new ones, and inevitably leaving readers with more questions than answers. In the intelligence world, that kind of uncertainty is not failure, it's utility. It keeps adversaries guessing and allies wondering how much is being withheld. For the few who had known him personally, the mystery carried a quieter weight. They remembered his measured speech, his ability to read a room before he even stepped into it, his habit of making you feel like the only person he was listening to. These were not traits you forgot easily, and they were not traits you could entirely bury, even under a new identity. Many people still think that the final chapter of his life, whatever it is, will never be written down, that it will end the way it has been lived since 2007, in half-truths, shadows, and unanswered questions. So what do you think? Is a man's legacy defined by the deeds people can confirm, or by the mysteries they can never solve? In the quiet of late nights, long after the world has stopped asking, the idea of him lingers. Somewhere, on a dimly lit street, behind the closed curtains of a rented room, or perhaps nowhere at all, Ali Reza Asgari's story continues, untold. And now, as we step back from the maze of shadows and whispers, the pace begins to slow. The cold Ankara streets fade, the hurried glances and coded exchanges dissolve, and we are left with the stillness that comes when the noise of speculation finally drifts away. The story of Ali Reza Asgari has been one of edges between truth and rumor, loyalty and betrayal, presence and absence. But edges soften with time. What once felt urgent becomes distant. The players move on, the files gather dust, and the memory of the man becomes a shape in fog, more felt than seen. For a moment, imagine him not as the operative or the ghost, but simply as a man sitting alone at a table in a quiet room. Perhaps there's a cup of tea cooling beside him, the steam curling upward in the muted light. There is no rush, no watchers in the corner, no coded words to pass. Just stillness. Maybe he is out there, living quietly under a name that isn't his, walking streets where no one knows to look twice. Or maybe he is only in the stories now, kept alive by the telling, a shadow that moves only when we speak of him. Either way, the truth belongs to the dark, and the dark keeps its own counsel. So, take one last slow breath. Let the threads of the tale loosen and fall away. The lights in Ankara are dim now, the voices hushed, the roads empty. Somewhere beyond them, the mystery waits, unchanged, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Sleep well, knowing that some stories are meant to remain unfinished.